So, this really all starts in the computer lab of my Christian school when I was 11 years old. So, I'm a PK, pastor's kid, grew up in church and in the faith, and like I said, was part of Christian education. Had a buddy come up to me one day in the computer lab back in the day when you had a designated room in the school for the computers, and he just kind of nudged me and said, "Hey, check out this website. In 2001, which was the advent of broadband internet, in 2001, the rate of erectile dysfunction among men under the age of 40 was about 5%. Now, that's normal. That's what you'd expect. We've all seen the Cialis commercial and that's a different demographic we're talking about generally. Today, you look at that same demographic, 40 and under, they're experiencing erectile dysfunction at a rate of about 30%. Thanks so much.
All right. Shall we dive in and talk about pornography?
Let's do it.
All right. Just since we've been on such a personal note, why don't we start? Tell us your personal journey, your personal story around pornography. How'd you get from point A to point B? How'd you get to the point where you're actually now helping men all over the world deal with their own pornography issues?
Yeah, becoming a pornography addiction expert was not the dream career that I had as a little boy growing up. I'd much higher aspirations to be a pizza delivery boy. That's what I used to tell everybody. One day I'm going to deliver pizzas. So, this really all starts in the computer lab of my Christian school when I was 11 years old. So, I'm a PK, pastor's kid, grew up in church and in the faith, and like I said, was part of Christian education. Had a buddy come up to me one day in the computer lab back in the day when you had a designated room in the school for the computers, and he just kind of nudged me and said, "Hey, check out this website. This my buddy, my soccer buddy told me about this." And so I typed it in, very innocent sounding site, and that was my first exposure to pornography. I had never seen it before, never even really heard about it, and it's not like I got hopelessly addicted overnight, but it just planted a little seed.
Oh,
And
so
by the time I
you're
was,
11 and you go boobies for free, right?
yeah, well, yeah, but I even had a little bit of confusion about it. Like I had never, because I hadn't seen anything, it was almost like it was overwhelming a little bit. And I was prepubescent as well, so there was like there was a mixture of emotions, but it planted a seed. And by the time I was in high school, I was watching pretty regularly. Um, I had a feeling like this is probably not the best thing for me, but also how bad could it really be? There's worse things to do as a teenager. I kind of had all these justifications to sort of insulate my pleasure. And you mentioned the bio. I was quite academic, so I skipped a grade. I went straight into university. I was working very hard to get my honors degree, five figures in research grants, so doing lots of research in the labs there, working with kids with autism. I was sort of stacking my profile. My goal was to get into med school. And that is where pornography really got a hold on my life because the only thing I ever had to look forward to in a day was viewing porn.
Mm.
I would go to school early, I'd do my lectures, go to the lab, whatever. My days were stacked, but maybe I'd skip out on a seminar here and there. Maybe I wouldn't necessarily do an assignment on time. I did not miss pornography. It was the thing that kept me grounded, as it were, in those days. And so I again was very aware of, okay, this is probably becoming a worse problem. I still kind of told myself I could quit whenever I want. It's not really a big deal. In the middle of my university degree is where I also had a really strong, I would say, faith experience. And like I said, I grew up in the faith, but you can grow up in the faith. That doesn't necessarily mean that you carry it into your adult years. And so I was in a season of just figuring things out. Do I believe what my parents have taught me? And if I do, how do I know it's true? And working through all that while also under the tutelage of some really respected professors in my field at the time that were atheists. So it was actually a great experience for me to just hear a completely different set of beliefs and a different worldview and all that. Out of that season, though, I did become a committed Christian, and I knew when you make that decision, I knew that there were some lifestyle changes that had to come with that for me, because I was getting drunk on the weekends. I had bad language, and I was watching a lot of pornography, and to clean up those first two issues, Robert, was no big deal at all. I was able to change course pretty quickly. I went about 3 days without pornography, and it, kind of jolted me. I kind of thought, oh, that's strange. That's weird. Okay, I'll muster up a little more self courage or self control and get some courage, and away we go. And I just for probably I was probably about 18 months to 3 years just was caught up in this cycle, just going back and forth, going, weeks, sometimes even months without pornography, but like a dog returning to its vomit, I
Right.
just kept coming back. And my
And and
only,
and and listen, we'll come back to that, I think, in our discussion about that
yes,
cycle of addiction, because that does seem so relevant. We'll come back to it. And I love you
yes,
just quoted, "The dog returneth to his vomit, so does the fool that returneth to his folly." That I think
right.
is my all-time favorite Bible scripture. So how about that? You just threw out my all-time favorite.
Oh,
Yeah. So
that's cool.
you're
Yeah.
in the cycle.
In
One
the
thing
cycle.
I've always heard about addictions, that addictions are not a stopping problem, because every addict stops regularly.
Hmm.
Often they're a starting problem. The problem is
Mm,
every addict starts it again, part of that
hmm.
cycle. So
Yeah,
you found
well
yourself
said.
in that cycle.
Yeah. And at the time, I mean, if we compare now to, 10, 12 years ago, the conversation around pornography is very different. I think it's easier to talk about. It's still a very difficult subject to broach, but the only solutions that they were really talking about at the time for me were internet filters, in a faith context, pray more, white knuckle your way through it, willpower, street count, maybe see a therapist, that sort of idea. But what I realized after about 3 years of doing all of these things is I was running over a really prickly weed with a lawnmower. You're just trying to logic your way out of it. I watched the thing I don't want to watch. Let's put an internet filter on it because that'll stop it. And that would be true if this were a logical problem. If it was a logical problem, a logical solution would work. And what I realized about 3 years in is this is actually an issue of the heart. This is about the internal individual realm. And so I began to just explore other options, and try to figure out what is trauma and how does that play into this, and what is this whole self-regulation thing about, and core lies and identity. And I start to address or identify some things that actually address more of the root level issues. And that's when my life really began to turn around. And I remember kind of just voicing this thing in my heart and even praying it at times that if God, if you can help me figure this thing out, if I can really figure this thing out for myself, I'll do everything in my power to help as many other guys figure it out as well. Because it was such a debilitating addiction. It was a debilitating issue to have in my life. I often felt very powerless, very hopeless about it. And so February 2016 was the last time I watched pornography. And I waited a few years. I wanted to really make sure I was in a healthy place, that I was actually able to help other people. I didn't want to be the blind leading the blind. And it was the end of 2018, December 2018 is where I launched Deep Clean, which is the practice I have now. We've helped over 1,000 guys quit pornography and have just continued to champion a message about encouraging guys to go a little bit beyond the surface and get underneath to the real heart of the matter, to quit pornography and live to their full potential.
Oh, beautiful story. So you sent me some stats about pornography, and I don't know that we need to go into any one of them in depth. And let me just read quickly a few of them, and then I basically want to ask you is why? Why is pornography such a huge dynamic in our culture? And more of your information, studies show that the effect of pornography on the brain is comparable to heroin and cocaine. And this one doesn't surprise me, but it freaks me out. The average age of first exposure to pornography today is 8 years old. You say most studies give that range of 8 to 10. I remember my first real experience with porn was at Boy Scout camp when I was 12, and some boys had porn magazine, and I kind of wanted to fit in and go look at them, but actually I was bored and felt
Mm,
really out of place. So like kind of like your first experience, it's kind of like, I don't know. This doesn't
yeah.
really do anything for me. Until then, later on, I went back, so I wanted to fit in. Can we look at the magazines again? I didn't really want to look at the magazines, but I wanted to fit in with the other guys 'cause I was kind of the youngest there. All right, why is
Yeah.
it a problem? Why is it a problem for society? Why is it a problem for individual men? Why is it a problem for relationships? Why is it a problem for men's sexuality? So I kind of throwing a bunch of shotgun questions.
Yeah.
Why is it a problem?
Yeah,
From where you sit, where do you see it as a problem?
I think there's a couple spokes to the wheel. I think number one is probably where the biggest devastation happens is relationally. So, if you look at any kind of stat or study around how pornography affects relationships, there's pretty good indicators that men who view pornography have less capacity for empathy, general emotional connection, and generally over longer periods of time, they report reduced relationship quality or relationship satisfaction. In 2001, which was the advent of broadband internet, in 2001, the rate of erectile dysfunction among men under the age of 40 was about 5%. Now, that's normal. That's what you'd expect. We've all seen the Cialis commercial and that's a different demographic we're talking about generally. Today, you look at that same demographic, 40 and under, they're experiencing erectile dysfunction at a rate of about 30%. There's a bit of a fluctuation there depending on the survey, but you have a 6x increase. So this stat really illustrates, I think, some of the issues that pornography causes. Um, for those of you that maybe aren't connecting the dots even on that statistic, pornography is what they call a supernormal stimulus. It's an unnatural amount of stimulation for your brain and for your body. So what that means is initially it's very overwhelming. It's kind of it's like intoxicating, but it's also like a little bit, it's almost your body gets overwhelmed. But if you watch enough of it, your body starts to build a tolerance to it. And what happens is your threshold of what your body requires to experience arousal goes higher and higher and higher. And maybe instead of, it requiring a 7 out of 10 or something like that, it requires a 20 out of 10. You need so much stimulation, so much to have any kind of physical response to the point that when you get in bed with a real person, it doesn't have the same level of stimulation. Even though it's real, it's not comparing to what your body has been experiencing because your brain can't determine what's a real image or a fake image. It's all real to the brain if it's seen a picture of something. And so that I think that really illustrates the damage it causes, number one, to your own body. Your own body starts to get programmed around it. But number two, the relationship quality, and you and I know this, what what determines your quality of life more than anything else in the world is the quality of your relationships. And so when you can't connect emotionally with someone, when you can't connect sexually with somebody that you love, that starts to become a problem. So I think those are the core issues. And I think one other thing that makes pornography problematic is the spiritual part of it. And it's been really interesting to delve into the research because there's a lot more data now that shows a very strong correlation between purpose in life and abstaining from vices like pornography. And men who have purpose in their life and are on mission are actually much less likely to view pornography. That's been repeated in multiple studies now. And I found that in my own community, when guys find their purpose, they tend to be able to quit pornography more easily. And on the flip side, if guys really focus on quitting pornography, which is kind of our specialty, they generally will find their purpose as a result of what they do. So I think you have personal, individual impacts, mentally and physically. You have the relational impact, the ability to connect, and then you have a spiritual impact in the sense of purpose, values, and your relationship with God, if that's applicable.